The title of this session, Demystifying Japan, really means something, or even more than something. Do you really know the reality of the Japanese market? Don't you recognize the Japanese market as far less promising to your business without any concrete fact, figure, or evidence? Please take a look at the reality and think about your plan over again. I believe this session opens up this kind of opportunity for you. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator and panelists. A moderator, Mr. Masa Ishii, Managing Director, AZCA Inc., and a visiting professor of Waseda Business School in Tokyo. Masa has been internationally recognized as an expert in U.S.-Japan corporate development. He is also a visionary in innovation and entrepreneurship. He is also a partner at Noventi, a venture capital firm focusing on early-stage technology investments. Panelists, Mr. Toshiya Otani, Managing Director, TransLink Capital. Mr. Andrew Lindquist, Sales Director, High Street Partners, Inc. Mr. Steve Skrysak, President and Founder, Pacific Reach Advisors, Inc. Ms. Rochelle Kopp, Managing Principal, Japan Intercultural Consulting. All of them are very savvy on both sides of the ocean. Now I would like to let the moderator begin. Mr. Ishii, welcome to our session.
Thank you, Okada-san. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Masa Ishii of AZCA. AZCA has probably helped a number of companies in the United States to go to Japan through probably more than 300 projects over the past like 25 years. But by mid-90s, a lot of companies in North America started going to Japan. Excuse me, could you please, if you could, someone could close the door? I appreciate it. Thank you. This is much better. Right. So by mid-90s, a lot of companies in North America started going to Asia, to Taiwan, Korea, and China, and other countries, passing Japan. And soon after, Japan went into a very long, dark tunnel of economy. And just recently, for the first time in 6 years, the Japanese government declared that the economy is finally, quote-unquote, recovering. And certainly the consumer spending is robust, and capital spending is picking up. And so the Japanese market is expected to be attractive again for many U.S. companies. On the other hand, it has been a long time perception that cracking the Japanese market is very difficult, or at least not trivial. In fact, oops. If you look at this table, I don't know if JETRO would be very happy to see this table, but among the almost 190 nations in the world, Japan is ranked to be the 20th in terms of ease of doing business. If you look at China, though, oops, how do I, pointer? Well, as you know, as we all know, the size of the economy of Japan is the number 3 in the world for some time, and Japan is ranked to the 20th. But if you look at China, certainly the size of the economy is the second largest, in the world. But in terms of doing business, ease of doing business, China is way behind other countries in Asia. So today we have 4 distinguished panelists for this roundtable session to share perspectives and demystify Japan in each of their areas of expertise. Okada-san briefly introduced everyone on the panel, but let me just go over again. To my left is Toshiya Otani. He's the managing director of TransLink Capital, a venture capital firm based in Palo Alto, right? Next is Andrew Lindquist, a sales director of High Street Partners, Inc., and that supports companies with the global operation and the international growth, including, of course, Japan. And he is based in San Jose, right? And next is Steve Skrysak. He flew up from San Diego today for this occasion. And he is president and founder of Pacific Reach Advisors, Inc., an executive search firm that specializes in cross-border leadership, recruitment, and talent acquisition strategy, of course, including Japan. And finally, Rochelle Kopp. She's managing director of Japan Intercultural Consulting, an international training and consulting firm focused on Japanese businesses. I understand your firm is headquartered in Chicago, but you're based in the Bay Area. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to ask each of you to spend maybe up to 5 minutes to demystify Japan by sharing your experience and the insights on how companies can enter the Japanese market successfully and operate there successfully. And then I'd like to ask perhaps some, each of you, depending on the context, some questions that relate to the topic that I think particularly of important or interest to the audience. And after that, I'd like to open up QAs to the floor. Okay, let's start. And Toshiya, please.
Thank you, Mr. Ishii.
Excuse me. Before that, maybe I should share this slide with you. Right. So doing business in Japan, there are, I mentioned 4 experts. And the first one, Toshiya, is the entry strategy. And Andrew for legal, tax, and operation. And Steve, the human resource. And Rochelle for cross-cultural communication. And so please.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Ishii. My name is Toshiya Otani. I'm a managing director and co-founder at a firm called TransLink Capital in Palo Alto. Before I answer the question that Ishii-san posed, I'd like to start off with a brief introduction of our firm. Unlike my fellow panelists, I don't have any slides, so you're going to have to bear with my picture here for a while now. But at any rate, I think the introduction would help, not because I want to sell our firm or myself, but because of the way we're set up and our background, I should think would help in understanding where we come from and where, how, I view the world or we view the world in regards to Japan and U.S. relations here. So TransLink Capital, we're a firm based out of Palo Alto. We're a venture capital firm. Our team is an 8-person team. We have 2 Japanese gentlemen, 2 Korean, 2 Taiwanese, Hongkonese, and a Taiwanese Chinese gentleman. So you could call it a all-Asian cast. Our specialty really is that the 4 of us here in Palo Alto, including myself, have grown up in a corporate venture capacity. So at one point in our lives, we led the venture arms of large Asian technology firms investing here in Silicon Valley and trying to create strategic partnerships with our motherships back in our home countries. So that's Mitsubishi, companies like Samsung, UMC, and SoftBank. And our story is actually very simple. We are set up as a regular financially oriented VC, but our value add is to really create businesses with Asian firms or market entry into the regions that we cover. So again, that's Japan, Korea, China, and Taiwan. Our corporate venture backgrounds help, and that drives the strategy. Through our corporate venture lives, if you think about corporate venture, the largest advantage is the fact that you have a world-renowned expert in your backyard, and you can get feedback, nothing lost in translation. Now, if you look at something like a Samsung, who better to ask about a mobile technology than the person who runs mobile at Samsung, for instance? As much as us venture capitalists want to think we're smart guys, there's a specialist in that area that lives and breathes this every day. Now, the downsides of the corporate venture model is actually also very simple. If you take money from Samsung, in many cases, it's hard to do business with an LG or a Sony, which are arch rivals, right? Typically, the strategic investment is strategic, therefore, it comes with a lot of strings. And finally, there's a long, arduous process. So at TransLink, we try to simplify the process, saying, get rid of most of the red tape, but retain some of the advantages. And we take a piece out of the corporate venture playbook, whereby when we like a company, we actually do business development well before the investment. And that's how we verify the market interest and therefore secure position in a funding round. Now, trying to address the question around, strategic and alliances, I think, before we get to the how, which is really, the strategic alliances, how do you enter the market, is a direct entry strategy better? We ask three questions. And typically we start with the when, right? When we're dealing with a startup, when is actually very important. So is this the right time to enter Asia in general or do partnerships, right? We run into a lot of companies that have the aspiration, but just simply are not prepared. And so the when question is actually very important. Are you ready to enter? And that varies by sector, by geography, by a lot of things, but you need to ask the when question first. And in many cases, they may have the aspirations, but you are a seed-funded company that just doesn't have the capacity to do that. And if we feel that that's not the right timing, we will tell them. Now, the next question is, if you get over the when question, is really a matter of commitment. I think Dr. Hoover mentioned about his commitment into the Japanese market earlier. And commitment is really important for us as we go through our process. As I said, we do business development before the investment. Therefore, the company following through is a very important factor for us to run our process. So we don't ask for a commitment to, put $7 million into the Japanese market. What we ask is, though, a commitment to follow through with our process. And what that means is that you get on the ground, you follow up with the leads that we provide, and if those leads come to fruition, you make a commitment to the market. And that could be in form of a person on the ground, or it could be in conjunction with some product development, but some commitment to the market, and that's very important. And then the third question really is where, right? We started off with Japan. In our case, we cover 4 regions. And we asked the where question because Japan is typically, or in some cases, not the market to attack first. Because of a lot of reasons, right? And so we asked the where question, meaning, is Japan the first market you should enter, or is there Korea, Taiwan, or maybe a combination of different countries? And it's really important because the sequence could matter a lot. So I'll give you an example. In networking, Korea is very well known, infrastructure networking components, right? I'll give you an example like Juniper Networks. You probably know the name. Their first customer apparently was a Korean company. So a lot of Korean companies are willing to take a risk, a bleeding edge risk on the infrastructure side. And I think everybody in this room knows that Japanese companies are typically not. And so in many cases, you know, entering the Korean market first, getting a household name that everybody knows, working out the bugs out of your product and moving over to the pond, over to Japan, is a good strategy to follow. So again, the sequence, the where question is actually very important. Now, to address, you know, the strategic alliance question is after those three questions are asked, is really the how, right? Let's assume that you check off all the three, and now, you know, we're talking about the Japanese market. I'm a big believer in organic growth, and I've done this as a partner of startups, as an investor, and also in a startup itself. And the reason being is you need some physical presence, especially in the Japanese market, to make that business successful. And again, coming back to the park example given earlier, you know, putting feet on the ground, fortunately or unfortunately, is very important for the Japanese customers and partners. And that's just, you know, a fact. If you look at places like Korea, that's not the case. As long as you're willing to support here from the US, it typically works out, but not in Japan. And so, you know, organic growth, putting some feet on the ground, combined with partnerships, I think is a very logical way to go. Now, when we look at partnerships, we typically look at two things, right? One is, you know, obviously who's relevant for the company, but beyond that, it's really about looking for a large partner that can give you the cloud and marketing coverage, and also a very nimble partner that's willing to do more work, more effort, put more energy into the relationship. And typically, you know, having those two as you start off your business works very well. So that's kind of how, you know, I view the question initially around, you know, how do you create an entry strategy, direct versus partnering, and some of the background for TransLink. And maybe I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you, Toshiya. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but please hold until later so that they will have a chance to you know, have a very vibrant discussion with the audience. And Andrew, would you rather come up to the podium, or
I can do it from here. That's fine.
Either way.
Yeah. Maybe I will come up to the podium.
Can't get her with my face.
Andrew will address the tax legal preparation.
Yeah. So just a little bit of background about myself and my firm. So I work with High Street Partners. I joined them about a year ago. Prior to that, I spent the best part of my career managing operations in one way, shape, or form. 6 of those years were spent in Japan, where I was a general manager and a representative director of a multinational company. High Street Partners helps companies here in the U.S. and globally expand into new markets, from entity establishment through to payroll, accounting, and compliance support, as well as advice along the way. You know, it's funny, Ishii-san was talking about sort of those years of stagnation and recession in Japan, and I guess unfortunately I was there for a good portion of that time, from 2002 to 2008. But I tell you, I moved there, and I had heard, you know, the stories about the recession and you know, the economic doldrums of Japan. In the meantime, I'm watching 4-story Louis Vuitton buildings go up in Japan. So I'm really fascinated to see how the next 4 or 5 years play out in Japan, because my viewpoint was very different, you know, I guess from the economic experts as to the real economy of Japan. Certainly, we've seen over the last several months an uptick in a number of inquiries of companies interested in going into Japan. And really my purpose here today is to help debunk some of the myths of operating in Japan, help answer some of those strategic challenges that companies initially face once they've decided to go to market. The first myth is that setting up an entity in Japan is difficult, and the reality is it's not. The slide that you pointed out, Ishii-san, I think 20th out of 100 and some countries worldwide, I think, and being the easiest of the Asian countries to entry speaks to that. Compared to a lot of countries where you have high capital requirements to enter, Japan's not one of them. In fact, you need 1 Japanese yen. Strategically, you may not want to start with that. You may want to have a higher capital amount, but that's all it requires. The incorporation process itself can take from 4 to 6 weeks. I've seen it done faster, and I've seen it take longer, but I think that's a pretty good guideline to work with. Typically, if you're working with a promoter, you'll be on the faster side of that. One factor to consider is just the timing to set up a bank account in Japan. There's a couple of things to consider. If you're working with your local international bank, they may not be able to help you as much in Japan as they would in other countries. There are certain payments that need to be made in Japan in person, so you want to make sure that your corporate banking is done through a bank that has a physical presence in your market. Just a couple of considerations along this line. PE thresholds for Japan are generally low, so the risk is high that you may be establishing a permanent entity. And so my advice is always test the waters. Just don't step your foot into it until you're ready to go. There's a number of entity structures that are available to companies in Japan. Typically, the companies that we work with will operate under a KK, subsidiary type, but a branch is also available. Representative office is not an official entity in Japan, so you can't establish a bank account. You wouldn't be able to hold a lease in a representative office name. And again, the bank accounts, which I've mentioned. One other key aspect is for a subsidiary, you're going to need a representative director. A lot of times, companies like High Street Partners will act as a nominee director for a company, and there's reasons behind that. One is that the representative director takes on some risk. There isn't the corporate veil. Also, that information is their remuneration is disclosed to the public. So just there are times when somebody may not want that information disclosed. In terms of how they are compensated, they wouldn't necessarily be entitled to some of the bonuses. They would need to be structured under a fixed interval of remuneration. So a lot of times, those are the types of early considerations you need to make when setting up an entity in Japan. Now it's going to be easy, so that's the next myth, right? So you set up. I've just told you how easy it is to set up, and I guess similar to the Wizard of Oz, it's instead of lions and tigers and bears, it's compliance and tax and HR. There's a number of taxes. The corporate tax structure you see here is the rate, the effective rate for 2014. It's slightly lower than 2013. Also, Japan has a consumption tax, which has just increased from 5 to 8% in the tax year 2014. For companies just entering the market, there is the opportunity to be exempt from that. You'll want to get consultation as to whether or not it's proper to do that. And then you have a number of statutory employee benefits. And you're going to run into these in any country that you go into, but I thought it worthwhile pointing these out as to what they are for Japan. And I won't steal too much of Steve's thunder here because I know he's going to go into a little bit more detail. The HR considerations, you know, from a labor market, there's very few labor markets in the world that are better educated and they have the required skill sets. So that's a great thing. One of the things that, you know, typical mistakes that American or foreign companies may make in going into Japan is that they use a U.S. contract template that is not compliant to Japanese law. Typically, you know, it's not at will employment. The employees are under indefinite contracts. Another consideration is if you're going to be scaling up rather quickly, there are some mandatory work rules that you need to put into place within the first year of operations. And then, you know, just, you know, considerations of customary benefits versus what's statutory. You saw some of the statutory benefits on the previous slide, but customary benefits typical in Japan might be a twice-a-year bonus, which would be guaranteed. Now, a lot of foreign companies don't offer that, and that's fine. You just need to make sure that it's clear in your employment agreement that that's not the case. And you also need to consider, in terms of attracting employees, what you're going to do to compensate that. Another benefit that just might be worth mentioning is, you know, commuter's allowance. Everybody is going to have a commuter's allowance in Japan. It's not statutory, but it's pretty common in just about every industry. And I'll briefly touch on this because I think the panel is probably going to talk about this in more detail as questions come up. But, you know, some of the key success factors that I've seen over the years, you know, the first one is preparation. Do your homework. Ask your partners. Ask your peers. You know, develop your partner network before you enter the market. The key hires in Japan, I can't stress this enough. I think it's the biggest mistake that companies make when they enter a new market is not choosing their first, you know, strategic hires wisely. And it's not just about finding the person who necessarily communicates the best with headquarters. You know, typically you'll hire somebody who may speak the best English. Hire the person who's right for the job, who has the best skill sets, who knows the technology, the market the best, rather than somebody who interviews the best. And then, you know, just a practical advice for somebody who's managed operations overseas. Find ways to continue involvement whenever you're opening up new operations overseas. Create opportunities for exchanging information. Make sure that there's regularly scheduled strategic visits into that market. That, you know, increases the flow of ideas. If something's not working in Japan or something's working exceedingly well, it's great to find out why, so you can replicate it, change it, impact it. And then, you know, just like you would for any of your other new divisions, new products, you know, set the bar high and be prepared to adapt.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's see. Next, Steve. Steve is going to address human resource aspect of Japan.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I spent about 11 years living out in Asia, mainly in the executive search space, and I returned to the U.S. a couple years ago, and now do the opposite of what I was doing out there, mainly for Japanese clients here in the U.S. I work for a big company called Recruit Holdings. Some of you who know Japan are probably familiar with them, and did a lot of first on the ground type country manager searches for new market entrants, as well as established companies looking to upgrade their leadership or make a change. Rather than go through, you know, my opinion on how to recruit in Japan, I thought it would be interesting just to compare some of the stats in the U.S. versus Japan. This is from Manpower's 2013 Global Talent Shortage Survey, and they surveyed, of the companies that they surveyed, 85% reported recruiting difficulties in Japan. That compares with 39% in the U.S. and China at 35%. The global average isn't highlighted on here, but it sits between China and the U.S. And I think most of you probably understand the reasons for this, but I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the demographics contributing to it. Unemployment, historically has been low in Japan. Right now it's at 3.7% versus just over 6.5% in the U.S. Average job tenure in companies, this is from 2008 and only surveyed men, but 13.1 years for Japan versus 7.1 in the U.S. So along the lines of this thinking about career lifetime employment, it's still, although it's not actually there's nothing in a contract that states it. There's an underlying tone or theme within a lot of Japanese companies on this, and that just contributes to Japanese candidates being more risk averse, especially when it comes to joining foreign capital companies. They've seen companies exit the market over the years, and they're hesitant to join a company that's a startup that might have a similar end result. English proficiency, most people are probably aware of, but Japan is ranked at the bottom of Asia, 28th out of 30 countries. They're just ahead of Cambodia and Mongolia, I believe. And Recruit Agent, which is part of the group that I previously worked for, polled about 1,100 white-collar workers in 2011, and 9% reported being able to barely speak English or better. So I think that kind of highlights just how difficult it is. And a lot of companies, because of the language barrier, end up passing off recruiting duties to an agency, and I don't necessarily think that that's the right approach. Or they make a strategic mistake in their first hire on the ground, selecting somebody who interviews well or speaks English, and that also can be a fatal mistake. Science and engineering degrees. Japan graduates a lot of science and engineering degrees. 60% of first 4-year degrees are in these two fields, compared with 31% in the U.S. But according to Manpower, there's a shortage of IT skills in Japan compared with the U.S. So it doesn't translate necessarily into real life skills. The labor force, 42% of the labor force in Japan is female versus 46.8%. This is from the IMD's World Competitiveness Survey, and Japan ranks down in the bottom third. And within this, a lot of the roles that the women are employed in are not necessarily senior management roles, and that's illustrated by the fact that there's, I think, 1.2% of boards represented by women in Japan. U.S. I think is about 13.5%, to put it in context. Management talent from that same IMD survey, Japan out of 60 countries came 51st in terms of what they consider qualified management talent. So you're dealing with a very, very small population that speaks English, risk-averse culture that is used to long-term employment, and a lack of talent, lack of senior potential candidates, female candidates in the labor force, all creating a difficult place to recruit in. So social media has really transformed the recruiting industry, and I thought it would be interesting to look at the popular social media channels in Japan versus the U.S. And this is one area where U.S. companies could make a couple quick fixes to their recruiting strategy and probably do a lot more of it on their own. Facebook in the U.S. has about half of the U.S. counted as their current users versus 22 million in Japan. Interestingly, I think somebody mentioned this earlier, LinkedIn only has 980,000 users in Japan versus a third of the U.S. population. And today, a lot of recruiting softwares for internal talent acquisition teams, as well as recruiting agencies, are tied into the different social networks. So relying exclusively on LinkedIn to post jobs or source candidates is really limiting your reach into the market. Twitter, Japan has a pretty active Twitter population, 20 million current active users. But interestingly, the number one most popular social media network is Line. And a lot of people in the U.S. read Line as a messenger app, so they kind of think that it's like WhatsApp or some of the other apps out there. But actually, if you've played around with it, you know that it's quite similar to Facebook. And I haven't seen any recruiting companies really innovate around this social network yet, but I think that 1-2 years down the line, a lot of companies will start figuring this out. And the key is really to find out where your candidates are located online and active and engage them there. And looking at the hiring channels, this data is a little bit skewed because the top is from U.S. tech companies in Japan in 2010, and the bottom is from the U.S. across industries in 2012. But as you can see, recruitment agencies accounted for just about 40% of U.S. tech companies' hires in Japan versus 3% in the U.S. a couple years later. It doesn't have to be that way necessarily. I'm not an advocate for relying on agencies. I think the three most important things that companies can do, first, not rely on English. I've done a number of searches over the years where the company realized that the talent pool is very small in Japan, and they would either hire a full-time translator or they'd make a decision on somebody based purely on their their experience and the connectivity that they had to their targeted customers. And if companies can look past English ability and find a way to manage that, I think it not only does it expand the candidate pool, but also will probably result in a better long-term hire. Second is to have your hiring managers drive the recruitment process. Stephen Hoover's keynote speech a little bit earlier, he talked about entering Japan, and my previous firm placed the first guy on the ground there, and the VP that was responsible for Asia was very active in flying over, meeting the candidate numerous times. So I think that really translates into an interest on, perceived interest from the point of the candidate, and it also helps you, hire the right person. And lastly, I think that companies can make strategic decisions in the U.S. within their talent acquisition team to directly source candidates. A lot of, especially in the online space, a lot of companies are using LinkedIn, they're using Facebook, and they've got somebody sitting in San Francisco trying to source candidates, but they're targeting the wrong social networks clearly, with less than a percent of the population on LinkedIn, and they don't have the language skills either. So perhaps by hiring a Japanese-speaking contractor who can sit with the talent acquisition agency, if you need to hire 10 people in Japan, would be one strategy. Somebody that can interact and develop a relationship with the talent pool there. I haven't seen very many companies do that, but some companies have started to recruit directly in Japan. Oracle, a lot of the big companies, but some of the Japanese companies, Rakuten and other famous companies. So I'll hand it back over, but thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, next and final, Rochelle, please.
Great.
Intercultural.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Rochelle Kopp with Japan Intercultural Consulting. So what my firm does is it works with American firms that have Japanese customers or subsidiaries or entry plans for Japan, or Japanese important investors or partners, and helps them be more effective in working with those important Japanese relationships. We also do a lot of work with Japanese firms that have operations here in the United States, helping Japanese companies be more effective working in the United States and managing American employees. So I personally have spent a lot of time in Japan. I had, at the beginning of my career, worked at a major Japanese firm that was globalizing and got very interested in how Japanese companies interface with the rest of the world, their customers, their employees, their partners, etc. So I'm going to give you some perspectives just based on what I've seen over the years being active in this field. I don't know if I can demystify all aspects of cross-cultural communication in 5 minutes, but I'll give you some ideas to start with. So first I just start out with kind of this sort of the stereotypical image that some people might have if you haven't been involved with Japan, or if you just go by what you might find reading random things from old books or what you find on the internet. There's this image that Japanese have, well, I'm not going to be able to figure out what's on their mind, and they're going to have poker faces, and I'm new as supplier, how am I going to get in there? It's going to be hard. All those Japanese supplier firms are in there, and there's no room for me. People aren't going to be able to speak English well, and they're not going to be used to dealing with foreigners. It's going to be awkward. And, obviously we've had 20 years of doldrums in Japan, so that's left, some negative images. And also there's a lot of negative stereotypes about the ability of women to deal with Japanese. So those are some of the things you might have flowing out there. And so I'd like to talk about, what hasn't changed. Somehow we got my slides in a little different order, but that's okay. So there's a lot of things that have changed, and a lot of that picture that I just showed is really not relevant anymore. There's a lot more openness in Japan, and there's a lot more willingness by Japanese companies to look at new suppliers and partners than there was in the past. And there's an increased comfort level with dealing with foreign firms, but also a willingness to say, hey, look, the economy hasn't been that good. We have to be a lot smarter about how we do business. And if we can find someone who has a better cost or a better technology or better quality, and as long as they're having that commitment to the market and the service level, then we're going to look at them. So I think the environment in that sense is very different than it used to be. I think although we see from the figures we just saw, Japan does have a way to go on the English level. I think in general that the English skills that you'll find in the business world are better than they were in the past. You'll find more people who are more adept at and experienced doing business with people from other parts of the world. So I think that there's definitely a change in the environment. I think that the current Prime Minister's economic plan, which has been dubbed Abenomics, has really done a lot to perk up the Japanese economy and kind of perk up companies' confidence about the future, and it's just made the whole atmosphere a lot different. So I think that that's improved a lot. And I do think that there is a lot more comfort than there was in the past with women in professional and managerial roles. And this seems to be one of those stereotypes that won't go away. And I know recently I was doing some work with an American company that had recently been acquired, or actually just they were in the process of being acquired by a major Japanese company. And I was there to give them some information about how to work effectively with their new Japanese colleagues and make the transition and post-merger integration more smooth. And I had done one of my sessions, and one of the members of their very senior management team was female. And she said, well, Rochelle, I've done a lot of research and reading because I'm the kind of person who likes to go out and learn things. And really pretty much everything you said matched what I've found in my research. Except one big thing, I saw lots of people saying that, women can't deal with Japanese companies and, it's going to be a problem. And they had a very important meeting coming up that I was prepping them for. She said, I'm thinking of not going to the meeting. And I said, what is it that you've been reading? And it turns out it was stuff that was written 25 years ago. And a lot of publishers were 25 years ago writing books about how to do business with the Japanese. And now publishers are busy writing books about how to do business with the Chinese. And they haven't updated the stuff that's out there about Japan. And I said, you're going to that meeting. You can't not go to that meeting. And, the fact that she'd gotten this idea in her head from some of the stuff that's out there, I thought was really very scary. So I want to emphasize that that's something that's quite different than in the past. Oops, I'm sorry, we just got there. So I did want to emphasize, though, there are some things about Japan that haven't changed. And one is the way the educational system works and the core values that Japanese are inculcated with from the time that they're children. And one of those very important ones is attention to detail and process. So all the things that you've heard about Japanese customers being very, very fussy about quality, both quality of your product and service, and also the quality of your interaction with with them are still very much true. And so that's something that hasn't changed about Japan. You really have to be at the top of your game when you're working with Japanese customers. And for a lot of companies, they find that that's a great experience because it makes them be a lot sharper and helps them be more competitive in the other places they do business. There's still a lot of emphasis on hierarchy, and so when you're interacting with Japanese firms, being familiar with who's where in the hierarchy, trying to match people on teams from your side with people of a similar level is very, very important. We've heard a lot today about the importance of relationships and investing in those relationships, that time spent doing that really pays off, and it's still something that's very much essential in Japan. Japanese still are very indirect communicators, and so it's not always easy to figure out, is it a yes or a no or a maybe? And there's a lot of nonverbal communication that happens, so you might not get an answer, but you might hear a sound over the conference call that sounds like, right? Which usually means probably not going to work, right? So I think there's still a lot of those nuances of communication that is very important to get attuned to. A lot of it is really a matter of kind of getting your antenna out there and paying attention and realizing that there could be different signals. But I think that that's still something that's very much a key thing that Americans need to be aware of. I think that decision-making processes in Japanese organizations continue to be very, very different than ones in American ones. So if you are dealing with Japanese firms, being prepared for things to take a long time, understanding how the process works and how you can influence people at different stages is very important. It's not always going to be the straightforward thing that you might be used to in American firms that you deal with. And finally, one big thing in Japan that hasn't changed is the importance of etiquette. Japan is still a society where people really care about the formalities of doing business. And so being familiar with some of those things is also going to be important. So as I said, there's a lot of things that I think have changed, and a lot of those stereotypes that are out there from a long time ago are no longer valid. But there's still things that you'll want to be paying attention to that are going to be key to making sure you're successful. Thanks.
Thank you, Rochelle. And everyone else, thank you very much for very helpful and insightful comments. Actually, so exciting. We're running out of time. I wanted to ask some questions, but let me just limit myself to only a few questions, okay? Otani-san, you said, well, let's go back to this, this slide. You're a great fan of organic growth, but quite often a U.S. company is very small, typically, venture-backed small companies. They have very limited financial resource to build their own business in Japan. So what would be the practical sort of advice you would give? You mentioned 3 factors you consider, but if the market opportunity is significant, but the financial resources are limited, what kind of advice would you give?
Sure. We look at probably 400 companies a year, just the companies that we meet, right? And so, like Ishii-san, you said, resources are limited in a startup, and that's where, the question of, when is actually very important, right? When you only have 5 people on the ground, you're just introducing a product into the U.S. market, it's typically not a good time to try to enter Japan. On the other hand, in certain sectors, there are companies that can benefit from the Japanese market enormously if they're successful. So I'll give you an example. We have a company that we led a Series A investment called Chartboost in the gaming space. When we met them, they were just out of seed funding, but they had a very interesting services targeted toward mobile gaming companies. According to our model, we made 5 introductions to the top game publishers in Asia, including Japan, and 3 of them said, where do we sign? And so very strong indication of interest, right? That's an example. So this company is doing tremendously well. They've partnered with these publishers. They're doing very, very well. And I think they've benefited from those relationships in Asia. But that's because that particular sector, the companies in Asia, including Japan, were able to see beyond, the small company and see the possibilities because the market was a little more advanced in some ways than the U.S. market was. The opposite example is another company called Guavas, which is in the big data space. There are about 400 people now. We participated in a Series C, but they do big data analysis for carriers. They have almost every customer on the carrier side in the U.S., and now they're thinking about entering the Asian markets, and we're helping them as we speak. This is a typical case of an enterprise-related company, which in many cases, the Asian markets move a little slower, and they want to see proof points, and therefore, having success cases and reference customers here in the U.S. matters a lot. Right. In this case, they're just beginning to enter. So it depends on sector. You mentioned resources, so I'll touch upon that just a little bit. So it really depends on, how important Asia and Japan is to your business, right? You don't want to go in too prematurely because in many cases, the Japanese market punishes you a lot if you go in and retract out and try to go back in later. It's the typical non-success case. You want to be ready and go in and stick to it, right? And so for that when question is actually really, really important. And then comes, as I said, the commitment, right? Are you willing to follow through on that? You don't need 20 people on the ground. You need a couple of very good people, and I think all the panelists agree that your key hires, the first few, which could be all that you need, are very, very important, right? And so I think from a commitment standpoint, even as a startup, you could just commit a few people, but that's good enough if you select the right people. And so maybe I'll pause there. Okay, thank you.
Andrew, as you mentioned, the consumption tax has gone up from 5% to 8%, and soon it'll go up to 10%. What do you think the implication of that, consumption tax for U.S. companies trying to get into the Japanese market?
Well, you have the opportunity to be exempt. You have the opportunity to be exempt from that consumption tax for the first 2 years of operation. So there's a strategic choice that you need to make. Part of that is the amount of capital that you're going to invest. And if you invest, I think it's more than, I think it's 10 million Japanese yen, you're automatically subject to that consumption tax, and you wouldn't be able to be exempt from it. But if you're less, then you do have that choice. So for a startup or a company that's just operating, at least for the first 2 years, it may not be a factor.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We hear quite often the word, job hopper in Japan. Can you elaborate on that and how we avoid a negative effect from job hoppers?
Yeah, well, probably along the lines.
Or there may be some positive aspects, I don't know, but you can probably mention that.
People tend to move jobs or change jobs quite frequently in the Bay Area, where in 5 years somebody might have worked for 4 or 5 different startups. In Japan, as most of you are probably aware, if you move more than a couple times within a short period of time, then you're labeled as a job hopper. And kind of along the lines of people moving around from job to job, there is a pool of fluent English-speaking country manager candidates, at least in the technology space, which is my focus, that have never really achieved a lot of success in any other roles, but by virtue of interviewing well and being westernized, they tend to land jobs. So I consider them to be kind of job hoppers as well, but probably stay away from everybody who changes too frequently.
Okay, please, yes.
I can chime in on that. I remember my first year in Japan, we were looking to hire a senior salesperson, and went through the interview process, worked with some recruiting firms, and then 5 years later, as I was leaving, we were replacing that person who had left. And really, it was almost like the resumes recycled. I saw some of the same exact names come in, and not much had changed. So I can definitely account for that.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Rochelle, one question. So you touched upon the female, and actually Japan is ranked 131st out of 135 nations in terms of women contributing to the economy.
Oh, you mean the World Economic Council?
Exactly, yeah. That's right. Yeah. So can you comment on that and how? Well, this may be not an issue for companies from the United States into Japan, but maybe you can give some guidance, some insight.
Certainly, I think it's very interesting to look at that index, which I have, and a lot of it is based on political participation. So the fact that not that many women in Japan go into politics and become lawmakers tends to really skew that number a lot. And so people throw that number and say, "Oh, well, Japan's at the same level as Cameroon." It's not really a good comparison. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I could probably talk for an hour on the situation of working women in Japan, and so sort of hard to know where to start. But I think the key thing to keep in mind is that the situation has changed in Japan. 25 years ago, when they put in their equal opportunity employment law, which is similar to what we put in 1964, there was a lot of overt discrimination against women. And that has really gone away. But what the situation is now is that it's very difficult for women to have work-life balance, particularly if they have children. There are very strong cultural ideas that for women to work while they have children is somehow going to be very detrimental to the children. So women have a lot of pressure to leave their jobs when they have children. Also, logistically, due to the long work hours in Japan, it's very hard to keep up the pace when you have to go and pick up the kids and you have to leave at 5 o'clock and your company's calling meetings that start at 6. So the lack of family-friendly work environments also makes a lot of women say, forget it, I'm not going to bother, right? So you get a lot of women going off the track. However, for women in Japan who either don't have children or are very lucky to have their parents or their in-laws live nearby and take care of their kids, they are very, very successful. And so you're seeing more and more women in Japan in professional and managerial and upper-level positions. But it will always be that either they don't have kids or someone else is taking care of them, right? So, but I want to go back to what you said. This is a big issue in Japan right now, but it doesn't affect Western women doing business in Japan. And instead, I've seen many situations where Japanese firms have kind of given a lot of halo effect to senior women in American firms, that wow, she got there, she's got to be really tough, right? Because that would be the case in Japan. But also, a lot of times I've seen Japanese firms say, we really like dealing with senior American women because they're role models for our women. And in Japan, they're lacking role models, and so they're often very much looking for them, and they often look to that in the women that they deal with in American firms.
Great, thank you very much. Now, we don't have much time, but I certainly like to open up Q&A to the floor. If you have any questions, discussion, please raise your hand and ask. Yes.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Galino. I'm in marketing, and I help startups put their marketing plans together. One of the things that's kind of puzzling me a little bit is you've talked about how businesses in Japan is changing, there are more risk takers and so forth, but then you talk about the things that are the same, the hierarchy, the decision-making process, the emphasis on etiquette. Those two don't necessarily jive. I mean, are things really changing or not?
So the question is, have we been successful in demystifying Japan or not, right? So anyone could address that question? Yeah,
I
please.
could take a crack at it. Unfortunately, I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. You know, it's interesting because if you look at, so like I said, if you look at from the U.S. side, you know, there's, I believe, less and less to demystify. When I started my career 20-some years ago, you know, I worked for a trade and investment company, and there was little to be known about Japan. There was Made in Japan from Sony and so on and so forth, Morita-san's book published. But a lot of entrepreneurs here in the Valley knew nothing about Japan. I think recently, though, more so than a lot of Japanese nationals think, a lot of startup companies and their managerial folks understand about Japan much more. And they're making very practical decisions on whether to go to Japan for business or not. You know, the other side of it is, unlike a lot of Japanese nationals believe that, you know, everybody's going to China and India and so on and so forth, there's still a fair amount of interest in the Japanese market. And so, you know, as more than, you know, the Japanese think, I think that there's a very practical notion of if there's business, then I'll go there. And so, you know, on the receiving end, though, I think that there's, like I said, there's a little bit of both. And I'll just comment a little bit on that. You know, I think the issue is, in some respects, you know, and I look at it from, again, a venture perspective, the Japanese market is sufficiently large enough to support a lot of venture companies. So a lot of, you know, the risk takers within the country do not venture out of the country that much. You can create a $10 million business, take it public, and, you know, make your riches in some respects. If you look at areas like Korea, for instance, where my partners are from, there's a lot more talent that gets education outside of Korea, and hence, you know, start businesses here, and you see a lot of entrepreneurs here. And so, you know, Japan just has to do a little bit of more of that and start at that Japan, level, I think.
Yeah, maybe probably not as close as many people think, but may need some more effort to open up a little bit more. To me between. But any other questions? Yes, Jack.
So maybe you could comment on the aging worker. So there are things in the past which may still be true. At 55, there's a change. Retirement going from 60 to 65, perhaps. Part-time workers. The pension that employees get so that they can continue to live for the next 30 or 40 years after they've retired. Some comments on the aging worker.
Short answer, please. Yeah.
I'll answer. So retirement age in most Japanese companies in Japan is 60 years old. A lot of Japanese corporations have pretty generous pension schemes by U.S. standards that make retirement with that includes a Social Security payment similar to the U.S. Pretty comfortable. There is, although they recently passed some legislation against it, there still is a strong bias toward against older workers, and you know, I can't really see that changing. I see that in the U.S. as well. But overall, it's difficult, I think, for workers that are in their mid-50s to up to retirement age at 60. It's difficult for them to find work, and I see a lot of them become independent consultants and you know, taking on part-time jobs, and probably that will expand as the economy or as the working population ages a bit more. Did I answer your question?
Well, actually, there'll be a reception after this, and I'm sure each of panelists will stay for the reception. Please, you know, walk up to any one of them and ask specific questions. And I think we are running out of time, and I really appreciate your remarks, the panelists, and thank you very much for participating in this. Thank you.